Hello, everyone. This is Julina Ogilvie, partner and wealth advisor with Principal Wealth Partners. I am really excited to share with you an important discussion on the political and economic outlook with Bob Stein, Deputy Chief Economist of First Trust Advisors. They are one of the most respected economic teams in the industry, and he is responsible for leading a team of 20 economists whom conduct in-depth analysis and research. This is a 27-minute discussion, including 3 key items. Number 1, where are we in this phase of the economic recovery? He will also address the one question he gets asked most frequent. Second, the election. Where are the polls in this late phase? He compares us to the 2016 election and also discusses why this is important and what that means for his odds. And then finally, taxes. More specific, the proposal from the Democrats and the likelihood of them being implemented. I hope you enjoy. All right, so welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you join us, although sadly not in person, but what should be a lively discussion around the upcoming election. I think it's fair to say this is one of the most dynamic elections we've seen in decades. And every time I think 2020 can't get any odder, it does. I'm Julina Ogilvie, your host for today's event. Our featured guest speaker is Bob Stein, Deputy Chief Economist at First Trust Advisors. He's a frequent guest speaker on CNBC and Bloomberg, chartered financial analyst, and prior to First Trust, Bob worked at the Department of Treasury. Bloomberg has consistently ranked Bob and the First Trust economic team among the best in the industry. We have asked Bob to share his perspective on the upcoming election and its economic impact for about 20 minutes, followed by some prepared questions. So Bob, thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Julina. So I'm going to get my slides available. Hold on a second, and then I'll start it up. So we have a lot of ground to cover, not a ton of time to do it in. So let me kind of cut to the chase. I'm going to talk about the U.S. economy. I'm going to talk about politics. When I say politics, though, rest assured, I'm not going to talk about what I, Bob Stein, would personally like to see happen 12 days from today. I'm going to talk about what I think will happen instead, whether I like it or not. And I'll share with you the probabilities as I see them as of today, 12 days from the election, as well as some of the policy implications if those various probabilities come to fruition. In terms of the U.S. economy, we had the mother of all GDP reductions in the second quarter of this year. We declined at a 31% annual rate, roughly speaking, the steepest decline in real GDP for any quarter since the Great Depression in the 1930s. That said, based on the data we've seen so far for the third quarter, retail sales, industrial production, housing starts, employment, inventories, international trade, business investment, we're penciling in for the third quarter, and this data will be published next week officially by the government, an increase at a 33% annual rate, by far the steepest increase for any quarter since World War II. However, this does not mean the U.S. economy is fully healed. I would define a full economic recovery as getting back to an unemployment rate in the vicinity of 3.5% to 4%, which is where we were pre-COVID-19. I don't think we get there for another 2.5 years. I don't think we get there until the year 2023. However, the recovery has started. That is good news. Just don't get too excited about the report next week. Now, in terms of questions I've been getting lately, other than the election, the question I've been getting the most is how the United States government can possibly continue to spend the way it has lately. Is the United States of America heading toward being the Argentina of the 21st century, unable to pay our bills, completely bankrupt, ultimately in default on the U.S. Treasury debt? And the answer to that is emphatically no. It is true that the federal deficit was supposed to be $1 trillion before COVID-19 hit the U.S. economy. It ended up being $3.1 trillion instead. So I can understand where these concerns are coming. But here's how I measure the manageability, if you will, of the federal debt. What I like to look at is the interest burden generated by that debt relative to the size of our economy or relative to GDP. As you can see, back in the 1980s and 1990s, interest payments on the national debt were running about 3% of GDP. Pre-COVID-19, 1.7% instead, substantially below where it was in the 1980s and 1990s when there was no fiscal crisis in the United States. Now let's look at what happened since COVID-19 struck the US economy. Pre-COVID-19, when you look at interest payments in billions of dollars, they were running in January, February, and March consistently a little bit higher than they were in 2019. Since COVID-19 hit the US economy, not every month, but on average, interest payments have been significantly lower than they were in 2019. Now, the reason for this is obvious. Interest rates are lower. Let me focus on a couple of key points that I want you to take away from this discussion. Before COVID-19 hit the US economy, the average interest rate on all the outstanding Treasury debt, not the yield to maturity, but the interest rate the government was paying, was 2.4%. Remember that number. Since COVID-19 hit the US economy, the average interest rate on all the newly issued debt has been 0.2% instead. So as any homeowner can tell you, if you have a mortgage at 2.4%, you get to roll over a significant portion of it at 0.2%. The carrying capacity of your household for debt goes up. The same is true for the federal government. And then I look at where interest rates are going over the next couple of years. In short term, they're going nowhere until at least 2023. In fact, I believe that today, the Fed internally believes that they're not going to raise rates to the second half of this decade, and even then, very gradually. I'm actually a little more optimistic about the economy, and I think inflation will pick up a little bit earlier than the Fed now anticipates. I think they'll move in 2023. Either way, it's going to be a very long time and very gradual once they do. In terms of long-term interest rates, we might finish this year around 1%, finish next year, let's say 1.5%, maybe 2% the year after. Still, the average interest rate on all the newly issued debt over the next few years is going to be hovering at maybe 1%, significantly below the 2.4% that prevailed pre-COVID. That means our carrying capacity for debt substantially higher than it used to be. The United States is not heading toward being Argentina anytime in the foreseeable future. In terms of the election, let's take a bird's eye view of what the polls are telling us as of today, Thursday, October 22nd. I'm looking at the national polls with this slide, and I'm looking at the Real Clear Politics polling average, which is an aggregator of all the polls that are out there, not just one or the other, taking all of them together so you can get the big picture. What I like doing is looking at the last 125 days of the race and comparing where we are in this cycle in 2020 to where we were in 2016. And what you could tell is that right now, the lead for Joe Biden is significantly above where it was at the same point in the race for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. Right now, it's about 8 points to the advantage of Joe Biden. At the same point in the race 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was up by 5. So that's 3 extra percentage points with only 2 weeks to go for Joe Biden. And if this were the only information I had on the national election for the presidency, I would assume you'd leave Donald Trump for dead. However, it's not the only information we have. We know that President Trump made up a lot of ground last time in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. We also know that President Trump's electorate, President Trump's voting supporters, are very efficiently laid out across the country relative to his performance in the Electoral College. So he should outperform in the Electoral College what a campaign that normally gets his percentage of the vote would do. And then I look at key states around the country, like the state of Florida, where basically President Trump is running close to even with where he was in 2016. And then I look at the state of Pennsylvania, where again, he's essentially running even with where he was in 2016. And then I look at the state of Wisconsin, where he's actually slightly outperforming where he was at the same point in the race in 2016. One of the things that holds all these states together, Florida, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, President Trump won all of them in 2016. So because of that, I don't think he can be left for dead. I do think he's the underdog. I estimate today at, again, 12 days out from the election, that he has about a 25% chance of winning, but you simply cannot write him off at this point in time. Here are the probabilities, the way I see it as of today, again, 12 days from the election. I think there's about a 5% chance for a Republican sweep. Now, if you like to play the ponies, don't put a lot of money on this bet. Don't bet the house. Only 5% chance. You like to play the ponies? It's a 19-1 odds against. You wouldn't bet your house on a 19-1 underdog. Don't bet your house on this. But it is possible. If it happens, I think the Republicans would react by extending and possibly deepening the tax cuts they enacted in 2017. Another possibility, I think a 20% possibility, so President Trump wins, but the Democrats keep control of the House and House of Representatives. If that happens, I don't think either party will be in the mood to compromise with the other. You will get a fiscal stimulus in the short run, but I don't see any significant changes to tax policy over at least the next couple of years. I think there's a 10% possibility that Joe Biden wins the election, but the Republicans and Mitch McConnell keep control of the US Senate. And if that happens, all of Joe Biden's tax increase proposals are dead on arrival. DOA, simply not going to happen. However, I do believe there'd be an enormous amount of pressure on the Republican Party to compromise on at least some issues to make it seem like they're not knee-jerk reflexively opposing, just for the sake of opposition, everything Joe Biden proposes. So I think in the end, they would compromise on one particular area of tax policy, and that would be an increase in the limit on the state and local tax deduction. Now, normally the Republicans don't like this. And the idea is that if you increase the limit on the state and local tax deduction, that's a bigger tax cut for taxpayers in high tax states that tend to vote Democratic than it is for taxpayers in low tax states that tend to vote Republican. But it's still a tax cut. And so I think in the end, the Republicans would give away on that issue. However, my base case, the most likely scenario, is a Democratic sweep. I put the odds on any kind of sweep at about 65%. Within that percentage, though, within that 65%, I think there's about a 20% chance of a Democratic tsunami, which I define for my purposes as getting to 54 or more seats in the U.S. Senate. Now, if the Democrats get up to 54 or more seats in the U.S. Senate, I think the Republicans are going to be in a whole world of hurt. You have the possibility of eliminating the filibuster in the U.S. Senate, possibly more tax cuts than I think will happen. I will talk about those tax hikes that I think will happen. And I'll talk about those tax hikes in a moment. You have the potential of adding states like the District of Columbia, which would become a constitutional issue and go to the courts, but also with Puerto Rico and possibly Guam, each of which would come with 2 extra senators probably going to the Democratic Party, and each of which would come with electoral votes that would help tilt the presidential cycle back toward the Democrats in future elections. But I think the base case, the most likely scenario, 45%, is that the Democrats have a sweep, end up somewhere around 51 seats in the U.S. Senate, give or take. Now, if that happens, there are going to be some tax hikes. It is entirely plausible that those tax hikes don't go into effect as of January 1st, 2021. My best guess is they are enacted or passed in 2021, probably end up going into effect in 2022. Let's take a look at those tax increase proposals. I'm going to go through each of these step by step. I want you to keep in mind, if you're looking at a baseball player, you're excited if they hit 300. If a baseball player hits 300, they're successful, at least in the major leagues. As a policy prognosticator or policy forecaster based on the election, my goal is to not hit 300, obviously. My goal is to hit about 2/3. Okay, if I hit 2/3, 70%, I'm happy. The only thing I know about everything I'm about to tell you is I'm going to get some of this wrong. I think I'll get most of it right. After Trump won the election in 2016, I was on the road telling people he's probably going to cut the top rate, but it's probably not going to get all the way down to 35% like it was under President Bush, because he has other priorities as well. I said they would get rid or strictly limit the state and local deduction. They did that as well. For the top rate, they ended up at 37%. I said they'd probably lower the cap on the principal amount for mortgage interest deductions as well. They did that as well. I actually thought they'd go deeper on the mortgage interest deduction, but they didn't. Okay. So here are my predictions for what policy would look like if the Democrats sweep. Obviously, if they don't sweep, this isn't going to happen. But if there's a Democratic sweep, the first 2 things, and I put big green check marks here because I'm very confident of this. is that the top marginal rate on regular income goes from 37% to 39.6%. Now, 39.6% should ring a bell. It's exactly where it was for 8 years under Bill Clinton. It's exactly where it was in the last 4 years under President Obama. And we didn't have a recession during that entire time. That doesn't mean raising that rate is good for the long-term growth potential of the U.S. economy. I'm simply saying that by itself, it's not going to push us into a recession. We could have a recession for other reasons. Tight monetary policy, another wave of COVID-19, or strict draconian government restrictions on business activity related to that disease or some other. But I don't think this tax rate is going to, by itself, push the U.S. economy into recession. In terms of the corporate rate, it was 35% before President Trump took office. They cut it to 21%, he and the Republicans. The Democrats are proposing to go halfway back to 28% instead. Now, I actually look at this as a glass half full. I mean, did anyone seriously believe when the Republicans cut that rate to 21 that it was going to stay there forever through hell and high water? I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. Eventually, the Democrats would take back over and raise that tax rate. I mean, that's what Democrats do. So the fact that they would only raise it halfway back, I see that as a glass half full. Two other proposals that the Democrats are making, the Biden campaign in particular is making, that I think will end up influencing policy but not be enacted as currently proposed. One is eliminating the step-up basis of debt. Here's what that means. Today, under current law, and for many decades, Americans have had the benefit of a step-up basis of debt. So let's say somebody inherits $100,000 in stock. They sell it several years later, it's worth $150,000. When they go to sell it, they only have to pay the tax on the increase that occurred after they inherited that asset. That's a step-up basis of debt. What the Biden campaign is proposing is to eliminate that step-up basis. So if you inherit an asset, it goes from $100,000 to $150,000. When you sell it, you have to pay the tax not only on the gain that occurred after you inherited it, but the gain on the tax that occurred when your parents or grandparents or other benefactors owned it as well. And what that means is that you have to figure out what the price they originally paid for that asset. The problem with this proposal is that it's an administrative nightmare. Many people cannot easily figure it out because it's not always stock, cannot easily figure it out, the price that was paid for an asset. Even if it's stock, they sometimes have trouble figuring that out. So I think CPAs and tax accountants will raise bloody murder and scream about the administrative difficulty of implementing this. So in the end, they probably don't do this. What I see them doing instead is reducing the exemption amount on the estate tax. It used to be around $5.5 million before President Trump took office. He raised it with a Republican acquiescence or Republican agreement to roughly 11 million. I think they go back down to something on the order of 6 or 7 million instead. Another proposal, and this one I'm actually concerned about, is treating capital gains and dividend income as regular income for those earning $1 million plus. Now, what does it mean, regular income? Right now, capital gains and dividends for the highest earners are taxed at no more than 20%. Yes, I know there's a Medicare tax, but let's leave that out for the time being. If they raise it to the tax rate of regular income, it doubles. It goes to 39.6%, essentially 40%. Now, some people may say, well, that's no big deal. Not a lot of people make $1 million a year, and that's true. But the people who do own a heck of a lot of stock. And so if we raise the tax on them and they, at the margin, shy away from equity ownership, that is going to inure to the detriment of everybody who owns stock. Everybody who has money in IRAs, 401ks, pension funds as well, is going to take a little bit of a hit because doubling that tax rate on dividends and tax and capital gains for people in that income class is going to make them shy away from equity ownership. And that's going to be a little bit of a headwind for stock market prices. However, I do not think they'll actually raise it to 39.6. The last time we had a dividends tax rate that high was in the early days of the Bush administration in 2001. The last time we had a capital gains tax rate in that vicinity was in the early days of the Carter administration in the late 1970s. Even Jimmy Carter and the Democrats who controlled both the House and the Senate at the time thought that tax rate was too high. Reagan came along and cut it even deeper, but Jimmy Carter and the Democrats cut it first. So I think in the end, they raise this rate. I think we end up somewhere in the vicinity of 24 to 28%, not 39.6%. If we're in 24, 28% range, okay, that's maybe a little bit of a headwind for stocks. Stocks will still be, should be, significantly higher a year from now than they are today. You go to 39.6, well, that's going to be a big headwind, and we could have trouble in the equity markets. But again, I think cooler heads will prevail, and they won't do that. The last proposal I'll discuss, I have a big fat red X by. That's because I don't think it's going to happen. Here's the proposal. The Biden campaign is saying they want to apply the full 12.4% Social Security tax to all wages and salaries above $400,000. Okay. Right now, that tax, 12.4%, shared equally between employers and employees, 6.2 each, applies to the first 138,000 that people make. That's the Social Security wage base. And that tends to go up each year, like it has over the past multiple decades. So they're saying, well, we'll kick that tax back in at 400,000 for people making above that. So here's the deal. If this tax goes into play, that extra 12.4%, imagine being a Californian and paying a top marginal rate in California of 13%, plus top marginal rate for regular income for the feds of another essentially 40%. Now you're at 53, add in another 12, you're essentially paying in the vicinity of 65%. Okay. And that's before you're paying any wealth tax. That's before you're paying property tax. That's before you're paying any sales tax. So the marginal rate on any extra income earned in California would be extraordinarily high. And it'd be almost as high in New York City, where it'd be around 62%. Recently, the rapper came out, 50 Cent. He said 50 cents wants to stay 50 cents. He doesn't want to be 20 cents. Okay. He got the math completely right, roughly a 60% tax. So he's actually endorsing President Trump because he worries about the marginal tax rate that would happen if he's living in New York City with a 62% marginal rate. He also said the Knicks stink, and so maybe he wouldn't mind leaving. But that's his personal basis. So here's the deal. I think a lot of people living in the highest tax states, California, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, would privately, and many of them are Democratic donors and Democratic politicians, complain about this proposal. In addition, any change you make to Social Security cannot be done through the special budget process on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate that has been used previously to change the tax code. Tax hike under Bill Clinton in 1993, the tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 under George Bush, the tax cut in 2017 under Trump, the Affordable Care Act under President Obama back in 2010, all used these special budget procedures. But none of these things affected Social Security. And if they did, they couldn't have used those procedures. If you affect Social Security, those procedures are out the window. So in the end, they would need to be able to permanently end the filibuster in the U.S. Senate by changing the Senate rules or get 60 votes to break a filibuster. My best guess is they don't have the votes. And so we end up dropping that proposal to the relief of many people in those highest tax states. Juliana? I'm ready for questions. Or Julina, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. No, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, we do have some questions. The first one is in regards to the emotions around the election. A recent study shows that 45% of individuals plan to make changes to their portfolio based on the election. How would you respond to that?
So at First Trust, we spent 8 years under President Obama telling politically conservative investors to hold their fire and not make any changes because President Obama took office. We were very bullish about stock market, and we had a bullish 8 years, generally speaking, with a correction here and there. And if these politically conservative investors bailed on the stock market in 2008 because President Obama was elected, they missed out on a huge bull run. And then we spent the past 4 years under President Trump telling politically liberal investors at First Trust, we told them, don't bail out because you hate the orange man in the White House. It doesn't matter about his personal behavior. What really matters are the policies, and what really matters are the valuation of the stock market. And we thought equities were relatively cheap, but the stock market has gone up despite the antics coming from the Oval Office. Regardless of what happens in the election, don't make a change. I went through all the permutations, all the reasonable permutations that I thought might happen. The one I am personally most worried about is the demo tsunami scenario, because I do think there may be some significant changes coming down the pipe. In the short to medium run, even that scenario is not a reason to sell. And the reason it's not a reason to sell is because you'll probably have more stimulus in the short run. And so I think a lot of people will think that's hunky-dory, okay? And you probably don't have to worry about a trade war over the next few years. And so maybe the market will run up over the next couple of years. And Julina, maybe you'll be nice enough to have me back and I can talk about maybe the stock market 2 years from now being overvalued. Remember what happened on election night in 2016? All of a sudden, everybody went from Hillary's going to win to, oh my gosh, President Trump has won instead, or Donald Trump at that point has won. And so there was a huge drop in the futures overnight. And by a couple of days later, everybody had forgotten it. If you're thinking about changing your allocation according to this election, you're thinking about it wrong. Okay? Sleep through the next 2 weeks. Don't do anything. Just grit your teeth and bear it. Now, there may be dramatic moves in one direction or another. Entirely plausible. It can happen. Okay? That doesn't necessarily mean it's because of the election. We have corrections all the time. They happen. Grit your teeth. Get through it. Start thinking about focusing on your long-term plans. Talk to your financial advisors, but don't let your personal political preferences cloud your judgment.
Thank you for saying that. That is music to our ears here at Principal Wealth Partners. Speaking of election night, since we don't know if we're going to have a presumed outcome the following day, what should we be looking for that evening?
Yeah, okay. I kind of have a weird opinion about this, okay, which is that if we don't have a clear outcome right away or even after 24 or 48 hours, that actually should be good news for the market. That doesn't mean the market will go up because of it, but it should be good news. And here's why. In the world where the election is close enough to contest, that's a world where there has not been a severe Democratic tsunami. And in an environment without a Democratic tsunami, where it's close either way, maybe the Democrats control the Senate, maybe the Republicans, but we're not sure yet. That's a world in which nothing dramatic policy-wise is going to happen. And I actually think when the market catches its wind in the immediate aftermath of the election, they're going to realize a contested election in the U.S. Senate is for the presidency is good for the Senate. Chances are. And so if the market goes down because of a contested election, that's a buying opportunity more than anything else. Okay,
great. Thank you. And one other question that just came in is you talked about Biden being the front runner in the poll and about some of his challenges he may have in his proposal. Could you maybe elaborate on some additional challenges he may have if it's not a Democratic sweep to enact the proposal?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I'm trying to focus here on things that will affect the macro economy, so taxes, spending. I have to tell you that after his inauguration, I think if he does not have a sweep, in other words, let's say there's a Biden in the White House, but the Republicans are still in control of the U.S. Senate, it's going to be very tough to squeeze additional stimulus out of the Republicans after January 20th. Okay, they can do it. They can do it late this year in the lame duck Senate. After January 20th, it's going to be a different ballgame. I think the Republicans on that particular issue will be confrontational. And the reason is because there are many members of the Republican caucus who don't want to spend willy-nilly because back at home, they are worried about a challenger from their right in the primaries in 2022 or 2024 who claims to be against spending that much money. So stimulus up front is easier than stimulus on the back end if there's if there are opposite parties between the Senate and the presidency.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your insights on such an emotional topic we know this time of year. We also want to thank, of course, everyone for attending today. And we realize that joining a Zoom webinar is not as exciting as it is in person. And we're hoping to resume that in a very safe way in 2021. And look for upcoming webinars. We have one planned for November on retirement. And we hope that everyone takes care and is safe.